Good afternoon, Maine. This is Chuck Ellis, and you are watching the Muddy Waters Podcast, and I am your host. And the Muddy Waters Podcast exists to help the people of Maine better understand what's going on in the world of Maine politics and occasionally touching on national politics, especially when that affects what's going on here in the state of Maine. And I do that not by myself being the expert, as I say every time, but by bringing on the experts. And so today I am fortunate to have um, uh, Robert Bobby Charles joining the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be on. I hear you, Chuck, when you say good afternoon, Maine. I hear the echoes of Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams and the old movies.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. But yeah, thank you once again for coming on. Obviously, I could go into all of your credentials: Dartmouth, Oxford, something to do with Harvard, and 3 White Houses that you've worked in: Reagan, Bush 1, Bush 2, Assistant Secretary of State under Colin Powell. But the main reason, I mean, all that's great. The main reason I wanted to have you on, though, is with everything that's going on in our world, especially what's recently just hit the news and exploded, where our governor gave us conservatives a great opportunity going into 2026. I've been asking the question. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know exactly, how the law works when we talk about, where does the federal law begin and the state law end, or vice versa. And so, like, specifically talking about issues like some of the executive orders that Trump has put out. So there's the one about Title IX, the one about transgender treatment of minors, and just wondered if you could, kind of comment on, like, how much authority does Trump actually have over state law, more than just from a funding perspective, or at least explain that whole process.
Sure, I certainly will, Chuck. I think what I'll do is I'll divide it into legal and then political. What I do want to start with is tell you that the first 5 years of my working life, which was summers, I was cleaning and fixing toilets, 26 toilets every morning, and then I learned to build houses, and then all those lightning strikes that you mentioned just happened, which were really not expected things. But in any event, so the short of it is this. Very interesting moment in Maine history and in national history, because we have a president who is asserting all the powers that a president has to assert, and we can talk about the legal bases for them. And of course, the other day he invited the governors down to the White House, and Governor Mills took that moment to showcase her, I guess I'll call it ideological belligerence, and decide that she would say that he was wrong on the law, because what he had said and what he has said over and over is that the Title IX definitions of male and female are well established, have been established since 1972. And the fact that President Biden tried to unilaterally rewrite them in a regulation doesn't hold up. And so there is, under the statute, the right for him to withhold money. I think we get about 8% of our education money from the federal government. And he has the right to withhold that if a state does not comply. Maine is not the only one, but it is the most belligerent one, does not comply with the pre-existing federal precedent, with the current federal precedent, which occurred after those regulations, and with the executive order. So let me give you the legal layout first about why Mills is absolutely wrong. And I actually think she knows she's wrong. She's just being very assertive in her position, presumably to reawaken her progressive base. I'm not really sure why, other than she's gone to the ideological far left. So what do we mean by that? I'm going to give you 3 legal points before we go to the politics of it. Legally, Title IX was a fight that women and girls, biological women and girls, put up for a long time until in 1972. They call it the Patsy Mink Act, but in 1972, they passed the Title IX assurances that a woman would be safe, that her dignity, privacy, et cetera, would be held in high regard, equal regard, and that her opportunities, including, for example, athletic and scholarship, would be equal to a boy's. Myself, having, being the father of both a boy and a girl, I know exactly, what goes through your mind as a parent. The irony in this is that there have been 50 years of precedent, Chuck, that make crystal clear that male is biological, female is biological. The purpose, the plain text, and the interpretation of the law has always been what President Trump says it is, which is that males are biological boys are males and biological girls are females, and they're, no one else gets to enter the ball game. And so the interesting part is that Janet Mills benefited from Title IX because she was admitted to law school under the auspices of Title IX in 1973. She finished, and she then worked for an organization. She actually got a job. She was the first female to get a job in the Maine District Attorney's Office. Of course, she had a little favoritism probably there because of her father, but let's put that aside. She was the beneficiary of Title IX in getting that job. And in between those 2 points, she worked for, and you can look it up. In fact, you can go to her own oral history done for Bates College, which I did. I listened to the whole thing. She actually got a job working for a feminist organization who pled the early cases in Washington, D.C., that it was for biological girls and that that girls would be the beneficiaries of Title IX. So what does that mean, Chuck? It means that this woman, who is the governor of the state of Maine, who got there by benefit of the equality that was assured to biological girls and women under Title IX, is now stripping Maine girls and women of the dignity, the privacy, the opportunities, the safety, the protection of Title IX. That, to me, is one of the most extraordinary acts of hypocrisy I can think of a governor undertaking. But let's go to the law again. The second thing I'll direct people to is Tennessee versus Cardona, a decision that was rendered in January of this year, 2025, in which a judge, a federal judge, said clearly, and of course the Democrats have been very quick to take any federal opinion and apply it nationwide. So let's do that with this one. It's a federal court decision in the Eastern District of Kentucky, but it could easily be applied. In fact, it was implied that it should be applied nationwide. And it says 3 things. First, the Biden people in 2024, when they rewrote the regulation and redefined sex under Title IX, exceeded their authority. By all of the precedent, Supreme Court precedent, they were not allowed to unilaterally rewrite the definitions in Title IX. So that's number one. Number two, it chills free speech. It's unconstitutional. And the reason is that people have no idea, if we're going to have more than 2 sexes, then do we have 17? Do we have 32? We have 132?
Right.
So, and how many pronouns? I mean, my God, we'll probably start making up pronouns for things. People get fired for not even knowing.
They already have.
Yeah, there
they
you
already
go.
have made those. Like,
there you go.
I've heard there's over 50 genders, and some of the pronouns I've heard are just like, are you kidding? Like zim, things like that. But continue.
So, and to be quite honest, that federal judge said, without getting into those details, he said in a very clear opinion, it violates the free speech principles that we have long accorded and that Supreme Court opinion affirms. And then finally, he said this Biden regulation is arbitrary and capricious, which is a standard that makes it unconstitutional. So for 3 reasons, it is unconstitutional. I suspect very strongly that if it gets to the Supreme Court, it will just reaffirm again. But the existing standard today, based on 50 years of precedent and based on Tennessee versus Cardona, is that there is no right of Maine to step in and reinterpret, accept the Biden folks' opinions, just unilaterally redefining Title IX. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional, and it's clear. The last thing is there's an executive order that President Trump issued. An executive order, people say it isn't law. Of course, an executive order is law. It can be challenged in court as not being sufficient, not overriding a statute. But in this case, the statute is fully consistent with the executive order. What he says in the executive order perfectly applies to all of the Supreme Court cases and federal cases since 1972, which are in turn interpreting the Title IX statute. So Mills is wrong 7 ways from Sunday. And my opinion is, honestly, Chuck, she knows she's wrong. She may be ideological, but she's not stupid. And so why is she doing this? She is doing this, in my opinion, she knows she's wrong. She's stirring the kettle in order to stir up the progressive base, in order to raise money to run in a Senate race against Susan Collins. That's what I think she's doing.
I think that's a really good possibility. I mean, but one of the things that I was thinking about in relation to this is it feels like, because there's also the Maine Human Rights Act to consider, right? And the Maine Human Rights Act obviously is in conflict with Title IX. And part of the question for me is like, if they do fall in line with Title IX, does that leave them open to lawsuit in the state of Maine because of the Maine Human Rights Act? And is that potentially where she's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place?
Not really. She's
Okay.
put herself in that position. The
Well,
reality
definitely
is,
put herself there, but
well,
the
but
question is whether or not there's
yeah, no,
any. Would she
legally,
be able to be? Would they be able to be sued if they fall in line with Title IX based on the Maine Human Rights Act? That's the question I have.
well, okay. So first thing, I'll repeat to you something a law professor once said to me. It costs you nothing to file a complaint. So the reality is, undoubtedly, there will be leftists in this state that sue the government for following what is 50 years of precedent, a recent federal case, and the executive order. But I will tell you, Chuck, that there are some cases, and I'm a big 10th Amendment guy. I prefer states' rights, okay, over
Mhm.
federal, being trampled on by the federal government. But that's not this case. There are some environments in which the supremacy clause, and this is one, clearly and for 50 years it's clearly been understood that the federal law as it relates to Title IX, which is a federal law, trumps the state law. And now let me explain why. When Title IX first came into existence, a lot of states favored the idea that boys should get more money. Football equipment is more expensive than field hockey equipment. That the football teams and the hockey teams, there was a very strong disposition that male sports should stay dominant. And so that it was litigated. And after all of those cases were decided, they were decided in a way that allows girls to have equal opportunity in sports and scholarships and all these other things. They literally had to put a couple of states out of business in terms of trying to be singular. Same way that we have civil rights. It's a Civil Rights Act, okay? It's the same way we have civil rights initially in the South, Chuck. A lot of states did not subscribe to the Eisenhower era civil rights laws or to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and they were racist, okay? So what ultimately happened is the federal government came in and said, no, you cannot continue to be racist. And they said the same thing on Title IX. You cannot continue to be unequal in the rights that you give to girls and women in protection in all these other venues. It's not just education, it's also in hiring. And that's why Janet Mills was a beneficiary of Title IX when she was hired as the first woman in a district attorney's office. So end of the day, there are situations in which states' rights can triumph over it's called conflicts of laws. You can learn it in law school. It's a whole area of the law. And another area, so we have two big clauses, Chuck, that cause the federal government to have a right. One is the supremacy clause, which is why she's wrong on Title IX. The other is the commerce clause. And so the founders said there are some situations in which unity across the country is more important than what we have also preserved in the 10th Amendment. And they expressly put those two clauses in. For example, we have an interstate highway system. The laws that relate to that interstate highway system, like when they wanted to do it, now they've suspended it at this point, but when they had a national speed limit that everybody had to conform to, that was done under the auspices of now they reversed it, but it was done under the auspices of the Commerce Clause. So, and the reason for that is everybody from George Washington through Donald Trump understands that there are some things that keep us unified as a country, and the federal government, even though we want to keep it very limited, have a right to assert those. This governor absolutely knows she's in the wrong. She is in the wrong because all of the Title IX precedent and an executive order make clear that under these circumstances, the Human Rights Act, I could define, I could put in my Human Rights Act in my state that raccoons are just as equal as everybody else. But if the federal law is that no, raccoons don't get to go to college, then actually, no, it doesn't work. Okay. In this case, it's the reverse. Girls get equal rights to boys, period. It's the federal law. It's been that for 50 years. And, Janet Mills can't redefine genders and sexes to serve her political purposes when in fact the assurances in the Constitution say the opposite.
Yeah, well put. And I think one of the reasons I like to ask this question and have this discussion is because I'm not one of those people. There are many people, I think, that they just care, like, that they're whatever they want to have happen happens, right? And a lot of these people that are supporting Mills, for instance, right now, don't care about the law. They just care about the cause, right? And I think this happens on the other side too, where Republicans will be in support of unconstitutional executive orders, because they are in support of the end, right? And there's this idea of the ends justify the means. But like, I think it's actually really important that we follow the law, and I think it's important to understand that despite the Democrats, suggestion that Trump is acting as a dictator and he's actually the big bully in this case, the truth is that she is actually in violation of the law. She has no leg to stand on, and this is a ploy to gain attention. But the interesting thing is, while it may help her gain attention and raise some money on the Democrat side, in terms of like a Senate candidate race, I think it's going to hurt all of her fellow Democrats in leading into the 2026 election. Do you
You're
see
right.
her backing down on this?
I think she will be forced to back down by the courts. Okay, this very brave and rather silly statement, "I'll meet you in court," is kind of a goofy. It's a goofy statement if you think about what the law is. The law is actually. I mean, I'm not saying it'll be done on a motion to dismiss, but it might, and it might be done on a summary judgment motion. I mean, bottom line is she's wrong on the law, and so. I personally think she knows she's wrong on the law. I want to back up two steps. And you mentioned that Republicans, and I think you're right, often fall into the trap. We all do. It's human nature of wanting an outcome and being frustrated that we don't get that outcome quickly. And so we would like to see, for example, an executive order. I can think of 1,000 executive orders I'd like to see that I really wouldn't like to see because they aren't constitutional. But I want you to know that that honestly every executive order, and I've looked at every one of them. There's 73. Every executive order this president has so far put out is either clearly a reversal of an unconstitutional or statutorily wrong position that the Biden people took, or to borrow from your podcast's title, it is an area of muddy waters. So I'll give you one. Trump is challenging the idea of birthright citizenship by illegal aliens. Okay,
Mm.
the truth be told, that is an area of muddy waters because back in 1898, there was a Supreme Court decision that said that at the time, presumed to be legal immigrants, when they have their children here in the United States, a legal immigrant, that child born here is an American citizen. And one of the things that was muddy at the time was the status of Black former slaves. So where did they fall? So the court said, no, it's crystal clear that a child born in the United States of an immigrant or of any kind, at least as long as they're legal, that was the presumption, a legal immigrant will be considered a citizen. Now, what has happened up to now, most recently in the last 10, 15 years, is you have these anchor babies. What happens is an illegal alien jumps the line, jumps the border, gets in here, has a child. That child, and this is where the liberal courts have kind of twisted the law, that child is immediately a citizen, even though the parent is illegal. And if you are related to a citizen, then you can apply for legal citizenship as on the simple pretense that you're related to a citizen. So you have pregnant illegal aliens coming into the United States, have a baby. The baby's considered a citizen under sort of the rewritten or reinterpreted 14th Amendment. And now all of a sudden that illegal alien, because they've had a child, becomes a citizen. So what Trump is saying is, I don't think that the founding fathers, and in particular, I don't think that those who wrote the 14th Amendment and some of the early case law was intended to be reinterpreted as allowing illegal aliens to have the same rights as legal immigrants. And so is
Yeah.
that settled? Is that settled law? The answer is no. And if
Mm.
it is settled, it's kind of settled in the opposite direction. But is it worth challenging as a matter of clarification because the courts have not been clear about whether that was the original intent? Yeah, that's a legitimate executive order to put forward. And don't think for a minute that he thinks it's settled. That executive order was put forward to see if he could prove the constitutionality of a difference between a child of an illegal alien and a legal citizen.
Yeah, no, or illegal alien even. Yeah, so that's a really good topic. I really like that topic. And what's interesting is I was having a conversation with somebody who was not in favor of that long before he even published the executive order, and had a conversation. So I did some research, and like there aren't a lot of countries that allow for illegal citizens. In most countries, one of the parents has to either be a legal citizen or a legal permanent resident, and in
That's
some
right.
cases, even with that, it's not allowed. So, like, I know people, because my wife is from Rwanda but lives in Kenya, so I know people who were born in Kenya. But never, and their parents were legally in Kenya, but they still did not receive Kenyan citizenship. They were
Yep.
citizens of their parents' home country. And so there
You're
are a lot of
absolutely right.
countries that have that kind of an approach. And so I think there's a lot of people in our society today that have, they partly because they live in the United States of America and they have no idea about the rest of the world and how things work in most countries. And they also seem to ignore the challenges that we have we have here. They don't have, they don't have informed opinions, but I
Well,
appreciate
to
that
that
one.
point, Chuck, just a quick footnote on that. It isn't just Kenya. Most of the countries of the world are very restrictive in
Yeah.
how they will assign citizenship. And so,
Yep.
is there something wrong with us becoming that way? No. Does it violate the Statute of Liberty's promise to bring us your poor? No. You still have to follow the rules. You still have to, and there are there are multiple ways that someone can become a citizen of the United States. But if you start walking away from the laws, and this is what the left in this country has done, they've said, well, we're just going to suspend a few of these laws on the basis of what we consider compassion or maybe an opportunity to build our voter base. Particularly if you don't check IDs, and all of a sudden, golly, we seem to
Yeah.
have unusual turnouts here. But whatever their motivation is, they have justified, as you mentioned the phrase a minute ago, that somehow the ends justify the means, and that's not true. In a country where we abide law, rule of law either is or isn't. It either exists and you follow it, or it doesn't exist. Now, there are fuzzy, muddy places like the conflicts between state and federal law, and some of those are settled and some of those are not. But there are also international norms, and I'll give you another one, even though I'm taking you off topic here.
It's fine.
The Democrats make this statement that it was wrongheaded or unfair for President Trump to insist that Mexico hold citizens who are seeking asylum in this country on the basis of what we call a well-founded fear of persecution that is individuated to them from the country they're coming from. But actually, the international norm is exactly what Donald Trump has done. The international norm, long established both in this hemisphere and globally, is that you can come to our country from a country in which you are being persecuted individually. Maybe you're a Russian dissident, and if you show up in our airports as a Russian dissident, you've come directly from the country of persecution into the United States, and you can prove the presumption that you have a well-founded fear of persecution, then we will set an asylum date for you. By the way, 90% or so of those that get asylum dates actually don't even deserve them because they haven't proven that they have a well-founded fear of persecution that's individuated to them. They just want to be here. But the point is that when someone comes from Guatemala or Venezuela or Cuba or Mexico, or my God, we just had 30,000 from China, and they show up in Mexico and they make an appeal for asylum, the international norm is Mexico is not persecuting you. So you have to stay in the third country. You have to stay in that country until such time as we adjudicate your asylum claim. You don't get to jump from a place where you're safe, claiming that you're unsafe, into our country just because you'd like to be here and get all the benefits of being here. So this again is where Trump has actually just taken us right back to the proper, long established international norm. But if you look at CNN or MSNBC or the Atlantic Monthly, what you're going to find is they say, oh, no, 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 he's flipped the tables. The norm was that people get to come here into the country and run around the country for 2 years until they show up at an asylum. No, that is not the international norm.
Yeah, definitely not the norm. I mean, excuse me. Sorry. One of the cases I like to point out is how difficult it is to become a citizen of Japan. I've heard stories of doctors, Indian doctors who had been there for 40 years and they still were not able to get citizenship. And so we are far from the most restrictive. We are probably one of the loosest. The EU is pretty loose in a lot of ways too, but we're very loose compared to most of the rest of the world. Despite the potential risks that we have to have harm from some people from our people, and then also the economic risks of job loss, which some people don't believe is real, but I do think is. So
By the
anyway,
way,
so
just a footnote again on that,
yeah,
the Europeans are becoming more restrictive, and they actually are more restrictive on citizenship for those that are not part of the club, not part of the European environment, right? So Poland and Germany, we just saw an election in Germany, Romania, but actually even France and Great Britain, you don't get to just pop into the country and become a citizen unless by chance under the Schengen, visa routine, you come from one of the other European countries and you're already a citizen. So, there's a lot of inside baseball, and I find that Europe is very quick to criticize the United States on everything from citizenship to Ukraine funding. But if you turn the mirror around, on Ukraine funding, and I'm jumping way off the rail here, but on
yeah.
Ukraine funding, the United States of America, there are 32 members of NATO. The United States of America has provided more money for Ukraine than all other 31 NATO countries combined. So before you criticize us, take a minute, turn that mirror around, and think about it.
Well, not only are we paying more than our fair share in that situation, but we're also our economy is carrying their economy, right? The reality is that without us, they would have to make some real different real changes in how their world works, because it's funny. I've been following like investments for years, and I've been talking to people about how international would eventually pick up, and they've been talking about that for somewhere around 20 years. Most international was in Europe, and it continues, that portion continues from a stock market standpoint to underperform the U.S. market by leaps and bounds. And
Well, you're right.
again, the only reason
Yeah.
that they're not falling into a pit is because of how they're taking advantage of the United States of America and negotiating, as Trump talks about, unfair trade, where they're tariffing our stuff,
Yeah.
but we're not tariffing theirs, and
Yeah.
that helps their companies to be able to compete in the U.S. and ours not to be able to compete there. So anyway, that's a
No,
side note.
you're
We could go further
again,
into that, but
Chuck, you're absolutely right. And by the way, to bring it back to Maine for a minute,
yeah,
the truth be told, we have been put at a disadvantage, both Maine and the United States, vis-a-vis a lot of the European countries. And I think what Trump is doing on tariffs is exactly right. But I would also notice that a really thoughtful, I guess I'll call it ideologically, or not even ideologically, a thoughtful, freedom-oriented Maine governor should be looking to enhance the relationships we have with these European countries for trade, as well as countries like Malaysia, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, because they are they are consistent with us constitutionally. Instead of doing what Janet Mills did, which was to go over to China and try to bargain and barter more trade with China, a country that has already got us by the hair when it comes down to things like pharmaceuticals and other trade. In other words, why would we, the United States, and why would we, Maine, be looking to push more dependence on China rather than creating bilateral, strong, mutually supporting, with or without tariffs, relationships with countries that are free, and perhaps even with some of the third world, where we can enhance their relationship to the United States of America?
well, I think the simple reason is that people are greedy, and they want the cheapest option, and China has the ability to provide that, rather than, as you said. I think I'd rather. Let's be clear. I'd rather have more of the manufacturing happening here in the United States and paying more for it, knowing that my neighbors and my friends have better jobs and there's more money in America, less money leaving the country. But if we're not going to we're not going to do that. If we're going to trade with some of these other countries, I'd rather trade with countries that share our values rather than ones that hate our values, essentially.
So,
And
one of the things there to
yeah,
Chuck add to you're absolutely right. And one of the things to add to what you're saying is that, first of all, Trump has slapped tariffs on China, and by the way, on Mexico and on Canada. And you can ask the question, because tariffs are a little bit different from free and open trade, but they're not that different. So the question what you're doing is you're modulating or regulating the trade relationship based on what maybe some inequities. So for example, and I'm going to go right to what you just said, China has slave labor. China has very cheap labor. So that's why when you go to Walmart or even Hannaford's or somewhere else, you're going to find things made in China because they have very, and of course we've opened the door to them just like we have with
Well,
illegal aliens. But
really quick,
yeah,
don't they also, on top of that, manipulate their currency, and nobody
they
else will
do
trade
manipulate.
directly
Oh,
with their
you
currency, but they have to go through U.S. currency, so we get hosed every time anybody does business with China. Is that right?
You are absolutely right again. So currency manipulation, and people can look it up online. It's probably too complicated to get into here for, unless we want another 45 minutes on it. But the gist is yes. But the bottom line is when you put tariffs on a country like China or like Mexico, what you're doing, it's very simple. Trump is doing three things all at once. He is compensating for the fact that American labor is, we pay our labor what they deserve. Free, we try to pay our labor what they deserve, and that means we don't have slave labor in here, and we don't have non-unionized labor, and we don't much of it. And so what he's doing is he's bringing the bar back up again by making Chinese goods have to be as expensive as American goods, which ultimately causes people, if you do it right, to buy American. So we should have, by the way, Maine should have far more manufacturing, far more service industry, far more activity, both interior and along the coast. And we've become a very anti-business environment. Unfortunately, our tax code has to be thoroughly rewritten. But let's go back to Trump. The tariffs are encouraging people to buy American, number one. Number two, they're causing external revenue. They're targeting external revenue coming into the US Treasury. And number three, they're providing a true policy basis for the change of policy by these foreign countries. So what in particular did he ask of Mexico and of Canada? He said, I want you to get serious. He's asking it of China too. I want you to get serious about all this fentanyl that you're shipping into the United States.
Yeah.
I want 10,000 troops on the other side of the US border in Mexico to stop the traffickers. And by the way, guess what the Mexican president did? She did that. And then he said about Canada, I want you to make a priority of fentanyl so that it's not coming over the northern border to us. And Maine has the longest border of the northern states. And so what did Canada do? Well, let's just say moaning and groaning, they also created a fentanyl czar, and they've begun to coordinate with us. And I hear people saying, well, that was very unfair. There's only 43 pounds of fentanyl that came over the whole northern border, and there were 21,000 pounds that came over the southern border. And I say, well, let's talk about that. 43 pounds, just 2 milligrams of fentanyl will kill you. And if you divide 2 milligrams into 43 pounds, you get about 19,500,000 doses that are fatal. That 19 million, okay? That means you could kill the entire state of Maine 8 times over with the 43 pounds that came in. Is that serious? I would say, yeah, that's serious. That's affecting our public safety. And if you don't believe that, go to any town, any county of our 16 counties and look at what fentanyl is doing. I sit with these parents. I sit with these kids. And I'm going to tell you something, it's heartbreaking. And so is Trump right? Yes. And should the governor of Maine be supporting Trump on that? Yes. Is she? No.
Right. No, it's interesting too. I was talking about fentanyl because I think it's a huge issue that maybe does get some press, but I don't think it gets enough press. And I think as you kind of laid out, I think laying out how little of it takes to have a lethal dose is really helpful because most people don't understand. They're like, oh, 46 pounds, that's not that much. But when you say that they can kill almost 20 million people, yeah, that's serious, right? That's like, not quite, but approaching 10% of the population.
Well, and here's
5%
another
of the
thing.
population of the United States. So
Here's another thing. We
that's a
should
lot of
talk
fentanyl.
about, Chuck, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're absolutely right. And we should be talking about all the drugs in the state of Maine. Virtually all the drugs in the state of Maine, except for this high potency Chinese marijuana, which does, by the way, sometimes get laced with fentanyl, which kills kids.
Yep.
These drugs in this state, we have never, I mean, let me just say it this way, which I periodically do at Lincoln Day dinners and whatnot. When I was growing up in this state, we had maybe 5 overdoses. And those 5 overdoses would have been above the fold in the local newspaper, Bangor Daily News, Portland Press Herald, Sentinel, KJ. Last year in this state, we had 10,000 fatal and non-fatal overdoses. We lose between 40 and 70 children or kids a month in this state. And Janet Mills' response to that, we have only 350 residential beds for treatment in this state, in a state of 1.4 million. All these treatment facilities go down to Portland. I've gone down there. They're around the block looking for people waiting to get into treatment. Okay. So we have an environment in this state in which drugs are just ravaging the state. And Janet Mills' response to that, not effective treatment, instead cutting off law enforcement at the knees, recruiting, retention, morale at the pits for local, state police, and even DEA guys. I get a DEA brief every week. And instead, her answer, 20,000 units of narc.
Oh, I think we might have lost Bobby for a moment here. Well, I'll wait until I'll see if he comes back on. But that it's crazy what is happening in the world of drugs in our country.
Sorry, I'm
especially
start up again. There, are you there?
You're back, and we're still live. But I was just going to say, is like
Are
one
you
of the yeah. Can you hear me? You're good. I can hear you, but you can't hear me. Sorry, everybody. Technical difficulties. But what I was saying is about Narcan. One of the crazy things about what's going on in our state right now, as Bobby looks to get back on, is like it's I think it's mandatory, or parents have to opt out to not have their children get trained in how to Narcan somebody. That's the state of what's going on in our world, is that our teenagers are getting trained by the state on how to Narcan somebody because of how much we've got going on with drugs. And so,
I'm sorry to have I'm sorry to have cut out there. You know, when an incoming call comes and I'm on the phone, it blanks it. So, but I want to just close that thought out for a moment. We are a state that is under siege. This is a state in peril. Okay. And I don't mean it. Politics is one thing, and it's, you know, everybody's climbing a ladder somewhere. But the reality is, this is a state in distress. And if I were to pick the number one issue, it is public safety. We've got economic issues, overspending, overtaxing. We've got an education system that's in collapse. But if you don't have public safety, you don't have anything. And to put 20,000 units of Narcan into the schools and out there to then cripple law enforcement so they cannot stop tinted windows coming up over, you know, out of Lawrence and Lowell into Maine on 95, not to have a priority on the northern border, to believe that all this stuff is secondary. It's not secondary. It's primary. Right where I live, within eyeshot of where I live, homes are being broken into by people who are either on drugs or getting money for drugs. And why? Because 85% of the crime in the state is flow down from the drug issue. And it is the wrong answer to legalize. It is the wrong answer to hand out needles. It is the wrong answer to criticize law enforcement. The right answer, I mean, we don't have to sit here and admire the problem. The right answer is to properly upfund and give authorities back to local and state law enforcement, and to give DEA more authority here to work with us, and to encourage the federal government to support us, not to cut us off, but to support us. And then ultimately to try to re-empower law enforcement in this state so that they have the tools that they need to get the job done. And then to set up effective drug treatment and to get drug prevention back into the school systems again. Look, when I was growing up here, we started with the Pledge of Allegiance. I think that's a great idea. And then we had programs like Partnership for a Drug-Free America, Dare America. They taught you, stay away from these drugs because they will hurt you. They will eclipse your future. They will ruin your dreams, okay? And the bottom line is, those drugs were probably 25 times less potent than the drugs that we have on the street today. So can we get this back under control? Yes, we can. Within 24 months, we could get organized crime out of this state. But you have to turn the state red in order to do that, because obviously these Democrats, if I can just, you know, speak a little Greek here, they don't give a damn. Okay, they don't give a damn. If you gave a damn, you would be helping our kids. You would be helping law enforcement. You wouldn't be crippling them.
Yeah, if you talk to law enforcement, some of them will say it on the record, some of them off the record, but they aren't arresting as many people because they know that they don't have the support of the DAs. That's the reality. Like I was going to ask you, like, because like one of the claims, and maybe you can speak a little bit to this, one of the claims that I hear from some of my Democrat friends when I'm talking about some of these things is that that crime statistics are down.
You know,
And I
if one of the beautiful things about the English language is if you define away crime, if you define it as not crime, then it's not crime, right? And we have
yeah.
traffickers, all over this state. We had the most pure heroin ever found in this state show up in Lewiston about a month ago. Okay. We have fentanyl at levels that we have never seen before. I'm not out there blaming the kids. I've sat with these kids. They scratch their faces out. And unfortunately, I've sat with kids who've been Narcan 3 or 4 times. And I try to work with them and the parents before I sit down with a parent that's lost the child. And when you lose a child, I mean, it's not just it affects the parent. Yeah, it affects the child, but it affects the siblings. It affects the parents, the grandparents, the friends. And we're in a state again where we're losing 40 to 70 people a month to this. It is absolutely impossible. It's impossible not to look at this as a priority. And I hear my liberal friends tell me, Bobby, it's the new norm. And I tell them it's new, but it is not a norm and it cannot be a norm. And so, all of this flow down crime, we start from a place below where Chicago and Philadelphia start. But these organized crime groups, and I will name them, I mean, the Trinitarios, which are a Dominican organized crime group, are absolutely here. They're in every county in this state. We have the Mexicans here. We have the Chinese trafficking organizations here. And by the way, the marijuana grow houses are completely related over here to the fentanyl distribution groups. We have the what are they called? The gangster disciples here. We have the Crips here. We have the Bloods here. We have the Latin Kings here. We have that Venezuelan group now in New England. Listen, they are dividing us up like a board game, and that's why you find drive-by shootings in places like Saco near school buses. Okay,
Yeah.
bottom line is we can stop this. It is absolutely stoppable. I mean, I helped put the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel out of business. We should have a HIDTA in northern Maine. It should be designated a HIDTA. It is not. Why? Because governor hasn't asked for it. People don't seem to care about it. This attorney general is not concerned about suing organized crime and getting them out of the state. He wants to sue oil companies with a boutique firm in California. So, Chuck, common sense
Yeah.
is something most of us have, okay? Common
Yeah.
sense says look both ways before you cross the street. Common sense causes you to want to protect your children together with the love of your children, and why we should want to protect, for the love of our state, the peace and tranquility we had here. All it takes for evil to prevail, as Edmund Burke said, is for good people to do nothing. And what we've done is we've pulled our fist out of the bucket, and it fills in real fast behind you when you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting things too is like talking about how they don't have really any interest in addressing this is instead of like the Maine Wire brought a lot of attention to the Chinese marijuana grows to the point where I think some people are like, okay, guys, we got it. We know it's happening. But they keep beating that drum. On the other hand, Janet Mills, instead of addressing it, there were a bunch of these that were obviously set up and were illegal, and so they gave them licenses. That was their response. So,
Yeah,
despite the fact that the people that are working in those,
Chuck, this is what I'm telling you. If you legalize illegality, then you can
yeah,
claim everything's legal. Okay, it's not right. It's not
right,
legal. So here's the deal. God bless Steve Robinson and the Maine Wire and Matt Gagnon and
yeah,
all those people who fight for truth. Okay, he's putting truth out on the table. What you used to have happen is your public servants, whether they were Democrats like Joe Brennan or Angus King, that I kind of consider a Democrat, or
yeah.
they were Republicans like McKernan or LePage. When you had a true threat to public safety put out there, they all reacted to it. The question I would pose is, if we know we have more than 300 of these illegal Chinese occupied, cash bought, illegal high potency marijuana operations distributing their high potency marijuana together often with fentanyl, if you have this happening in the state, why haven't we asked DEA and then empowered our state police to take down every single one of those 300 houses? Why do we still have more than, I don't know, 280 of them sitting out there? It doesn't make any sense, Chuck.
Well, you did mention earlier, and this will go. We'll put a tinfoil hat on for just a moment. You did mention that Janet Mills was trying to court favor with the Chinese government. So who knows if that has anything
You
to
know,
do?
I will pull my Chinese, I'll pull my tinfoil hat off there. I don't really buy that, but I do buy this. I do buy that, again, if you look away from a problem because it's easier to look away from it,
Yeah,
then it's only going to grow. You know, if you allow a weed garden to go untended, it will grow more weeds and it'll eventually put out, you won't grow the crops you were going to grow. And so, you know, what we've got is public safety issues here are or should be, in my view, number one, because we have a government, a Democrat one party government, House control, Senate control, governor control, you know, all our constitutional officers, Democrats. And what they've done, I guess I'll put it to you differently. In my opinion, they own all these problems. They own
absolutely.
the
Yep.
fact that we have fentanyl overdoses like we've never seen in the history of the state.
Yep.
They own the fact that we don't have enough treatment that's effective. They own the fact that parents have nowhere to go when their kids are in peril. They own the fact that we had an education system that in my youth was number one or number two in the country and is now number 50, dead last in the
Yep.
country. The Democrats own that. Okay. They have taken out the things that were good and put in place of them things that most Mainers don't even know are there. And that are bad. And so, you know, and meanwhile, we've got, you know, just to give you one more bone of contention in my book, 7 years ago, this state had a budget of $6.8 billion. Today it's 11.7, 6.8 to 11.7, which means you're doubling taxes. Now, what was I asleep or something when the state doubled in size? I don't think the state doubled in size. I don't think there's any excuse for doubling the tax burden on Mainers who make a per capita income of $42,000. We cannot afford any more taxes. Chuck,
Right.
we have to
Yeah.
start thinking as if we are the everyday people because some of us are the everyday people. We don't have, you know, the luxury of imagining we have a permanent salary with the government to do whatever we want to do. No, we are actually, you know, raising kids, working every day, trying to make ends meet, trying to pay for rent, a rental place or a home mortgage. It's incredibly difficult. And that's why, you know, 60% of those under the age of 35 in the state of Maine are living with their parents. And at the same time, uh, are working. Most of them are working. They're trying
Yep.
to they're trying to work. And so, you know, it just doesn't make sense to me that we are kind of saying it's okay for the state to go to hell in a rocket ship. It's not okay.
Right. No, and I agree. It's like everything that's going on is insane. What the Democrats are basically saying to you is similar to what they said at my wasn't a city council meeting. It was a candidate night because I was running, and we had all the candidates that had the potential to represent Westbrook from city council all the way up to state senate came in, and one of the people, my opponent actually, who used to be on the school committee, she actually technically still was up until the election, basically got up there because a lot of people were frustrated about taxes and said, "Oh, yeah, no, we are doing everything we can. You just don't understand. These things need to be funded. We can't spend any less money. There's nothing that we can do. Just trust us. We're doing everything we can." And then at the
You
same
know,
time, they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes and make us not believe what we can obviously see. We know, for
yeah,
instance, that boys are boys and girls are girls. We know that our education
sure do.
system, even if they try to pretend that, oh, we can't trust the standardized test. Well, we see the kids, we engage the postgraduates. I have had managed, some of them. And like the reality is they are not there. It's obvious to anybody who's paying attention that they are not where they need to be. And this is not on them. It's on the education system.
You know, let
And
me
with,
take a
with
minute.
crime, we also know
Yeah.
that crime is far worse than they're trying to pretend it is. So they want to pull the wool over our eyes, but we see what we see. Go
No,
ahead.
you're
Sorry.
you're absolutely right. And by the way, Chuck, it's not just in Maine. You know, the FBI statistics report lower crime in Maine and around the country. But what they discovered is a lot of the Democrat cities and states were underreporting the crime that the FBI then in turn re-reported. So I want to take a word, just a moment on education because you raised it. And I'll make this a little bit personal. I come from a family of teachers. My mother taught for 40 years at Monmouth. I have a brother who teaches math. I have a sister who teaches. I have aunts and grandmother who taught, and I've taught a little bit, not in the public schools, but I've taught. And I'm going to tell you something. My father never got through college. The state of Maine, and I was just in public schools. The state of Maine gave me an education with 4 years of math and 4 years of science. We used to have earth science and biology and chemistry and physics. They gave me English for 4 years. They actually gave me Maine history for 1 year. It used to be a requirement. We got a foreign language. And so when I finished, again, a lightning strike, just by scholarships and loans and work, I was able to go to Dartmouth College. Do you think for 1 minute that I would have survived among all the moneyed kids at Dartmouth College if I hadn't had a good Maine public education behind me? No, I wouldn't have. And that in that era, we were in the top 5 year after year for what they called fourth grade math and eighth grade math, and then fourth and eighth grade reading. They did these national tests, which they still do. And today, not only is Maine number 50 out of 50, but our fourth graders, 70% of the fourth graders in Maine public schools cannot read up to level. That's not excusable, okay? I read the other day that the majority of Maine high school kids that graduate, you just lower the standards and then they get to graduate with all their woke activist ideas, okay? Literally, a majority of those who finish high school today in Maine have not read one of the classics from front to back. They have not read a book from beginning to end. Okay. Now, how are we? And then I'm gonna break it apart one more time. When I was growing up, we had what you call SHOP, industrial arts,
Mm, yep.
vocational technical training. Every high school had it. So if you wanted to learn how to weld, or you wanted to learn how to work under the hood of a car and figure out what a distributor cap was or how rocker arm covers worked, which I did, and I didn't do it in school, I did it out of school for work. But if you wanted to learn that stuff in school, carpentry or all of the trades, plumbing, okay, you could get it in the Maine school system. And some people would prefer to work with their hands and work outdoors and work on things that you know what, we've stripped all of that out of the schools. Okay, yes, there are regional centers, yes, you can find a way to do it, but the reality is and why do you think it costs so much to build a home in the state of Maine? Beyond the Biden inflation, we don't have the trades. We had the trades. We should be encouraging the trades. We should make it well-paid jobs for the trades. We're not doing that anymore, Chuck. And so, at a
Yeah.
certain
Well,
point in
they're
time,
well paid. The trades are largely well paid, but we're not getting kids who want
we
to do
don't have
them
enough. We don't
because
have
of the
enough.
way in which I would blame things like SEL, this like socio-emotional learning, which really is
Yes.
regressive rather than progressive. These kids
Yep.
are not developing the healthy coping mechanisms where they can deal with difficult situations. Well, guess what? You have to be able to do if you're going to work in the trades. You have to have thick skin. But instead, we're raising soft children who can't handle a little bit of criticism because it makes them feel bad. And if they feel bad, then we have to go through all these things and like basically cater to them. And it's just,
So you know what, Chuck?
I care. Yeah.
You are
But
raising such a good point, and I've gone back and looked at the curriculum, and there's some great people out there. I mean, I appreciate Heidi Sampson and everything she does. I appreciate what the Maine Policy Institute does. They did a great study. People should go look at that. I appreciate what people like Garrett Mason are doing. I appreciate what Laurel Libby's doing. We've got a lot of powerhouses in this state. We have some really strong, thoughtful people looking at education, looking at voter ID, et cetera. But if you look just for a minute at education, I went back through the whole curriculum for what they consider the standard curriculum in this state. First of all, it does not teach either on the math, reading, writing side, or over here on the trade side. It does not teach what it taught when we were in school. It does not teach what you need to be successful. But the biggest thing it doesn't do, it does not inculcate or teach the idea of the American dream. The idea that you don't just wake up in the morning, look at how a bunch of rich people on some, show on television or on your computer make you feel and go say, I'm going to strike it rich with a lottery ticket. No, it's hard work. Okay. You have to envision what you want to do. You have to believe you can do it. And then you have to go work your butt off to go do it. That's what we were told. That's what we were taught. And you know, one of the blessings of my life is that we were taught, I'm in a generation where we were taught by the World War II vets, the Korean War vets, and the Vietnam era vets. I had teachers, I just wrote a book called Cherish America, and it features, among other things, teachers who were veterans. And these teachers, believe it or not, Chuck, they had to learn mental toughness without a lot of training. When you're, oh, okay, you go, man. All right, get everybody to buy it. It's a great book. 56 great stories, and a lot of them about Mainers. But the reality is, these kids were 16, 17, 18, 19, and they had to go to war, and they had to win, and they did. And then they came back to Maine. All these little towns were filled with World War II, Korean War, Vietnam era vets. We probably have 100,000 vets today. And I was happy to be an intelligence officer, but nothing I did compares with anything that those guys did. I mean, they were in the worst of the worst. And
Mm,
and and so I
yep.
look at it and I say, we should be teaching mental toughness. We should be
Yep.
teaching self-reliance. We should be teaching confidence and optimism, not the idea that we're in a grievance culture where if you don't like something, you can blame somebody or make an excuse. And so that
Everybody's a
again comes
victim.
back to us. Okay, it comes back to our teachers, our local leadership, our parenting. It comes back to our governor. It comes back to modeling the kind of behavior you want to see these kids follow. You do that, and we will be one of the strongest states again, and we'll be a model for the country.
Yeah, no, appreciate. Yeah, no, I absolutely 100% agree. Toughness is what we need out of our kids. Toughness and problem solving, and they need to be proficient. Not proficient in the way in which the proficiency is used, which is really not proficient. You know, with proficiency based learning, it's really annoying how they co-opt and take over the English language, because proficiency is like actually you're able to do something. But with proficiency based learning, they brought in the ability of, like, if you get something wrong on the test, you can go back and take it over and over and over again until you get it right and not ever have to learn anything. You can get help from either the teacher or your friends, and it's ridiculous because we need kids to actually
So
learn.
do you
But
think? So
let
do you think, Chuck? Do you think the Chinese government does that?
no.
Do you think the folks
Well,
in their military operation got that special grievance treatment there? I don't think so. You know,
no.
and bottom line is we know what's right, we know what's wrong. We know the
Yep.
sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. And when you look up at the noonday sun and the liberals tell you that came from the west, you got to say, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, agreed. Well, there was another interesting development that happened recently, because Maine had passed that 72-hour waiting, like kind of red flag. I don't know if we would call it a red flag law. I think that's what it is. 72-hour waiting period when somebody is going to purchase a weapon, but it didn't work out quite as the Democrats and the governor expected. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
So we in this state, Chuck, I don't know, maybe we're different. I'm sure Wyoming and Montana have a few folks like us, but we grew up with guns. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a snow shovel, I have a rake, I have a shotgun, I have a long gun. And these days I have a 9 millimeter and a couple others. So reality is we grew up, and frankly, the Boy Scouts of America, which when it was the Boy Scouts of America, taught every kid
Yep.
in this state. And most of us were Boy Scouts in my era, truly, most of us. We would go to summer camps, Bombazine or Hines, and we would be in these 22, we'd get 22 training and we'd try to outshoot each other and get better. And what did we learn? We learned how to be responsible with firearms. And then maybe, in our backyards, we slung some clays and tried to shoot them. We learned to be responsible with firearms the way that I hope we're still teaching kids to be responsible driving a car. Okay. So that is the culture of the state of Maine. We learned how to be not only proficient in the real meaning of that word, whether it was for hunting or sports shooting or something else, or home protection, although we didn't really think much about that back then, we do now. But we
Yep.
learned how to use firearms and responsibly take care of them. Okay, so along comes the state legislature, dominated by Democrats for most of the last 30 years, and they have been gobbling up pieces of the Second Amendment, and then they've been slapped back by the Supreme Court again and again. Heller ruling, Bruin ruling, we could talk about all those, but gradually they still keep coming after us. Freedom continues to be assaulted and probably always will be until you push back. So what happened is that citizens in this state, both firearms sellers and owners, pushed back on this Maine state law that said, we're going to clip your wings in a whole bunch of ways. And one of the ways we're going to clip your wings is we're going to tell you that you have a 72-hour waiting period above and beyond the FBI background check, which occurs when you buy a firearm in the state of Maine. So unlike me, where I've gone in and done my background check and just made my purchase and walked out with my gun, people were being told they can't do that. That case came before the federal district court here in Maine. I think the judge is Lance Walker, and he wrote. I can't remember how long an opinion it was, but he wrote an opinion that is so cogent, it is so clean, and it is so clear. And he basically, with a preliminary injunction, said, no, I am not going to let that 72-hour waiting period for you to just buy a firearm stand. Why? Because it's a violation of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment doesn't say you have the right to keep and bear arms 72 hours after you discover you have the right to keep and bear arms. It doesn't say, and he said, you can't keep and bear arms freely and without restriction unless you can acquire arms freely and without restriction. He said it is a temporary dispossession or a temporary disarmament of the Maine population when you tell them that they have to wait before they can exercise their constitutional right. And so, very thoughtfully, pursuant to Supreme Court precedent, he threw it out. Okay, now a preliminary injunction is not the end of the day. It'll still have to be tried on the merits, but you don't get that preliminary injunction unless it is more likely than not, or there is a likelihood that you will prevail on the merits. If it's also understood that it's likely there could be irreparable harm if you don't grant the preliminary injunction. And one of the things they say, it's really quite clear, is people come in to buy a firearm very often these days in Portland, in York County, in up throughout the whole state for self-protection, and particularly women. Okay, so if I come in because I've got a domestic issue or something else, I'm a woman and I'm not a woman, but if I were a woman and I get in there and I want to buy a firearm to protect myself, there is irreparable harm if I can't buy that firearm. And then the Democrats throw up this idea that no, even if there's irreparable harm, even if there's a risk to the life of others, even if the Second Amendment is violated, we still need to do it because some percentage of suicides are tied to a firearm. Do you know that nationwide, firearms are the sixth most common basis for a suicide? Things like carbon monoxide poisoning and drowning and jumping off things, and these are all above the firearms. So you know what? Even if they weren't, you're not allowed. Our founding fathers were pretty clear. You are not allowed to take away my right to keep and bear arms, and that means you cannot take away or limit my right to acquire that same firearm, which is legally allowed to me, so that I can keep it and bear it. And the other thing that I'll just say is Clarence Thomas I'm pretty sure it was the Bruin opinion, because Scalia wrote the Heller opinion. Clarence Thomas said, let's also be crystal clear about what this keep and bear arms means. The founders didn't use words they didn't mean. You keep an arm in your home and you bear it when you walk outside your home. So for the moment, thank God, Maine still has constitutional carry, and we have a right to keep and bear our arms and to acquire them. And this judge said, no, you can't limit that. But don't think for a minute, the Democrats aren't looking to try to pass a red flag law. We've got yellow now. They're trying to clip this right every way they can. And I come back to, I think what we ought to do is have NRA safe hunter training for all of the kids in Maine who want it, and it ought to go north to south. I got it when I was 12 years old, and frankly, I'm a better person for it. I try very hard not to make stupid mistakes when I'm driving a car and when I'm handling a firearm. So yeah, it's a very important decision. It happens to come out of Maine, but I think it will probably go to the Supreme Court and he'll be affirmed.
Yeah, no, and what's interesting is that I think a lot of people don't really understand, people who aren't around guns, because for a significant portion of my life, I was not around guns, and I just felt uncomfortable around guns. And then some things changed, and I decided that I wanted to have them and be trained in them because it's a tool, and just in the event that there's a reason that I need it, I want to be able to have it and want to be able to use it well. And I got together with some people, and like people who are serious about guns, which are most of your conservatives, most of your people who have guns, the first thing that they do is talk about like gun safety, right? Like, I mean, you should take a safety course anyway, hunter safety or something like that. But like the reality is like that is like the number one thing you do when you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I shoot? It's like, well, before we talk about how to shoot, we're going to have a conversation about how to be safe. Like know your weapon, know what's going on, and like all these rules to protect against something like that happens. So we're very safe with them. And these laws, the yellow flag law and the red flag law, are responses, quote unquote, to what happened in Lewiston. But the reality is, like that guy, had weapons for a long period of time. These laws would not have prevented it. And this is just an example of government
The other
basically
thing about
taking
that,
advantage of a situation to be able to pass something that they wanted to pass that wouldn't have an impact in that situation in the first place.
yeah, let no crisis. What did Rahm Emanuel and Obama say? Let no crisis go unutilized for whatever your political purpose is. Yeah, it's sad. When that occurred, and it occurred not far from me here, I'll tell you that I was on Fox all day that day just talking to people, and I explained that they said, "Oh, you're going to get all these gun control laws they're going to push forward." And I said what you said, Chuck, which is they wouldn't have made any difference in this case. This had to do with the fact that I think people were afraid to report because they were concerned about what he would do to them if they reported, and that went up to and included National Guardsmen who were with him, I think, in New York. But in any event, putting that case aside for a minute, I said, no, you misunderstand how the state of Maine works. Within 5 miles of where I sit, there are probably 1,000 people who have taken out their shotgun or their 9mm, and they're just ready in case any bad thing would happen. This Second Amendment is doubly important in an environment where we cannot get police on site, for an hour because there are insufficient number of patrols. We cannot depend on anybody but ourselves. And so, maybe that'll change in the future. That'd be nice. We get more law enforcement out there, able to, get paid well and go do their job and not be, second guessed. But more to the point, people have firearms here. And I'll tell you something, Chuck, I'm a little older than you. I hope not too much older, but, in my era, it really did not matter whether you were a Democrat or unaffiliated, we used to call them independents, or you were Republican. It really didn't matter. Virtually everybody in a radius of 10 or 15 or 20 miles from me here where I grew up, they all had a shotgun. Okay, they all had a rifle, maybe a 30-30, maybe a 30-06. Did they get a deer every year? No. Did they always go out? No. Did they know how to use it? Did they take care of it safely? Did they believe it was their right to be able to hunt and to protect themselves? And God forbid if the government came to their door to defend themselves if they had to. Of course, they all did. And so it didn't really matter. Democrats, I mean, I'm not going to name them, but name Democrats who are alive today. If you asked them, do you own a firearm? If they're over a certain age, they did. They know how to use it well. They take care of it. And we were that state. We are kind of the Bill of Rights state. We believed in free speech, the opportunity to worship when and where we wanted to and whatever we wanted to. We believed in the Second Amendment. We believed in the Fourth Amendment, that you don't get to come into my house and just ransack it because you've got a warrant, or unless you've got a warrant. I mean, and you better have a good warrant. I mean, and the Fifth Amendment for due process, equal protection. The Sixth Amendment, taking people to trial for no good reason. We are a state, I think, in our heart. I would actually like to believe 85% of us still believe the Bill of Rights are paramount. We believe that what the founders wrote, they meant. We believe the Supreme Court, even if you don't like some of their decisions, that they are an institution that puts the law above people, and we therefore have to listen and abide those institutions. And I think they expect that our governor and our attorney general and our legislators are going to share those basic sensibilities with us. And I think the shock of it is, Chuck, that a lot of those legislators on the Democrat side do not share those sensibilities with us. And I guess shame on us. We need to pay closer attention and flip this state red in 26.
We absolutely do. And I think part of the problem is that like people just get into a habit of being, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, and they just vote without thinking, or they buy into the lies and the fears that are pushed about, about the Republicans. For some of these Democrats that are, maybe JFK Democrats, or just, people who have historically believed that the government should do some things to help some people, and the Republicans don't care, or the Republicans are racist. Now, these things are not true, but this is what people tend to believe. And there's a fear that kind of pushes pushes them to not consider, another option. But there's an assumption, as you're kind of mentioning, that their representatives would not be so partisan and be so, I would say, so crazy. And unfortunately, we're not being represented well, which is why we do need to flip the
let me
state
take off a
red.
little bit on let me
Yeah,
take off a little on that, Chuck. I
sure.
I actually think I say 85%. So 85% includes some Democrats.
Yep,
I
quite a few.
believe that quite a few. I think we are a state that like to consider ourselves the reasonable man and the reasonable woman. And instead, what's happened is these national forces have come in and they've kind of tweaked our sensibilities in such a way that whether it's through social media, they've kind of wound us
Excuse me.
up. Having worked many years with Colin Powell, if we got too worked up, he'd say, just don't get spun up about this. It's not worth getting spun up about. And what we've had happen here is a lot of this California leftism has been, and New York and Boston has been imported into Maine, and they've encouraged us to not trust our neighbor, not go back to those sensibilities, call them Norman Rockwell American sensibilities, and instead to get spun up and to blame each other for things. So I'll just tell you, it's an unhealthy way to look at things. It's not the way Ronald Reagan looked at things. It's not the way Donald Trump looks at things. By and large, he's an optimist. He wants to believe there are solutions to problems and that there are common solutions. So let's just take the top 3 or 4 things we've talked about, okay? Public safety. I believe most Democrats do want the supply of fentanyl and heroin and cocaine and heroin and cocaine, heroin, meth, crack. They want it out of the state. They don't want it in the state. I don't think they want to see organized crime in this state. I don't believe. I believe most Democrats do not want to see that happen. And so let's talk about that instead of pretending that there isn't a common point. I think most of them want to see their kids, their grandkids, their educational system produce kids that later become successful in life. In order to do that, you have to teach the skills and the attitude that causes people to be successful in life. And I would encourage any Democrat watching your show, any unaffiliated voter, and certainly every Republican, think about what your parents taught you and what they lived through, what your grandparents taught you and what they lived through. The concept, yeah, the Bill of Rights, but the concept that you are responsible for your own destiny and that my obligation is to go out and do the best I can on any given day with what God gave me. And some days I'm going to fail, some days I'm going to get it wrong. Some days I'm going to fall and have to remind myself that they got back up, so I need to get back up again. But education is about teaching positive attitude. That's not just everything's going to happen for me. It's about I need to take responsibility for my day-to-day life and my future. And I'm asking you, encourage me, give me opportunities, show me, give me a chance to show you what I can do if I'm a kid. But which happened with me. That's why I get to clean toilets every day for 5 years, But in reality, and then build houses. I got an opportunity to learn what I could do. We need to teach those kids to believe in themselves and to believe in the future, and of course, maybe along the way to have some faith in God. But the reality is, we have opportunities here that we're missing. So education is another common ground. Another common ground is being able to pay your taxes. We're the number one property tax state in the country. We've got the number
Yeah,
4 tax burden in the country. And as I mentioned a minute ago, our budget has almost doubled in 7 or 8 years. It is
crazy.
inexcusable. And I'll be honest with you, I believe a lot of Democrats, because I've talked with Democrat legislators, maybe 2 dozen of them, and I won't name them for fear that they'll be punished by their own party. But a lot of them agree with me that property taxes are not where they belong. The supply of drugs has got to be reversed, and our education system is failing. So just pick those 3 issues, then we can talk about the rest of it. We're in a state right now where we've been convinced by the national media, who's been imported here. We've been convinced to believe that we are more against each other than in favor of each other or in common with each other. I'm going to tell you, most Mainers have more in common with other Mainers than they do with anybody else in the country. And most Americans have more in common with Americans than they do with anybody else in the country. And that goes from the left to the right. There are always going to be extremes over there and extremes over here.
Yep.
But the bulk of us are in the 85% who know common sense. And Chuck, we just got to get back to that.
Yeah, I might agree with 75, but I think what maybe even 80. Actually, there was a poll recently. I appreciate your optimism as always, but there was a poll recently. I think that Fox News put out when Laurel was on this morning, and Representative Laura Libby, and it showed that like 79% of Americans, for instance, were against uh, biological males competing in women's sports.
Yeah.
So I think you might not be far off in some of these categories. But yeah, I think there's hope. I think it's partly how we have that civil discourse. It's something I talk about in this podcast a lot. Is like, how do we get out there and we change it? Yeah, we've got to win in 2026. How we do that is by having conversations, sharing conversations like these with your friends. We're going to have shorts come out of this video. You're going to be able to share those with your friends, and this podcast is on just about every platform you can find a podcast on. And then also, like, between Instagram here, TikTok, and Facebook, shorts are going to appear there. You can take those, share them to where your friends get media and information, and help people to see that there is actually a reasonable approach to policy, and politics that's coming from not the left but the right at this point. So vote red, 2026. Before we go, Bobby, there was an article that came out of the main wire this morning, speculating on potential people who might be running for governor, in 2026, which is a big thing that's coming up. And one of the people whose names was on that list is speculated potential 2026 gubernatorial candidates for the Republican Party was one Robert Charles.
Look, Chuck, I will tell you, I'm not animated by the idea. I have all the titles I need in life, and I've had a wonderful, long, blessed life. I don't need to do anything else. So it's not a matter of trying to be something. But as you know, and as I think most of us know, I'll use the words again because I think they're real. We are in a state of peril. This state is in real distress. And so, am I considering it? Yes, I am. I'm talking to lawyers. I'm talking to fundraisers. I'm serious about it simply because we have to have the leadership in this state that causes us to win the governorship, both chambers in the legislature, because a governorship without both chambers is useless. And also, frankly, at least CD2 and maybe even CD1. And I believe that when you focus on the issues that really matter to, I call us everyday Americans. I'm wearing my suit today for you, but the reality is, I'm usually, in a t-shirt. Everyday Americans, everyday Mainers are really getting sick of being betrayed by people who are arrogant, like this Governor Mills is, and that somehow think that they can make decisions for us and keep making the wrong decisions instead of letting us make our own decisions. So the short of it is, I am sure we're going to generate a good gubernatorial race, and I believe we will generate the next governor of this state. But it's going to take all of us, Chuck. I mean, we got to lean into the wheel. We got to push. And we got to believe, let's take that thing that I say to kids in high schools. We have to envision what we want. We have to believe that we can do that thing that we envision, and then we have to work like the Dickens to get it done. And I sometimes tell people, as I did several people this morning, who, I'm on a lot of media, and one of the things they ask is why hasn't the Republican Party in the state of Maine done this before? And I say, look, we're a group of Clydesdales. We're very strong, we individual Republicans, and we have great leaders in lots of areas. And Laurel is one, and Mike Sobolewski is one, and Joel Stetkes, and Jim Dearmond, and Heidi Sampson, and just lots of people out there. And I've spent lots of time with people like Bruce Poliquin, and we have an amazing stable of really strong people who have good fiber, good values. The problem is we've been pulling in opposite directions. And what we need to do is take that Clydesdale team, put it in harness, and all pull together. I guarantee you that if we do that, we will blow these radical leftists out of the water in 2026. We will have a truly red state. And we can hold that red state for decades if we do it right. If we don't do it right, if we don't have the right candidates at the local level and all the way up through, we will suffer at least 10 years of progressive leftism. And I don't know what happens to the state after that. So we got to think
Yeah.
positive, we got to work positive, and we have to believe we can do it. And am I one of those horses in the stable trying to do my part. Yes, I am, and I will continue. And I think you're doing your part, and we all have to do our part. That's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I appreciate that. And regardless, I mean, if you look at the Main Wire article, there's a lot of candidates. Only one, or potential candidates, I should say, only one officially declared, Robert Wessels. But a lot of potential people. My biggest hope is that if it is a crowded, primary, that we can all be civil and behave well. One of the problems within the Republican Party, I feel like, is that we tend to it's like herding cats, and we all have our opinions, and we can get very frustrated with one another, but which is fine to a degree in the primary, as long as we work together in the general. Obviously,
You're right.
that's assuming that a candidate that actually represents our values gets out of the primary, but it looks like that should be the case, no matter who's nominated there.
No, you're absolutely right, Chuck. I mean, I worked for Ronald Reagan, and his 11th commandment was you don't criticize other Republicans. And that doesn't mean that we're not sometimes wrong, and privately you can have that conversation and encourage greater teamwork. But in the end, we have to be a party that understands the higher purpose, the mission, right? I often use sports analogies, and I wasn't a very good football player, only played for 1 year. But one of the things I remember is that if you leave light in the line, they will go through that light. Okay, they will go through the hole in the line. And the problem is, for 30 years, minus the very favorable and thankful LePage years, which remind us what can be done, for almost 30 years, we've let light in the line. We've left holes in the line every single cycle. And we have to just say to ourselves, do we really want to win? Do we really
Yeah.
want to win both chambers back? Do we really want to? We cannot be content being in the minority. And unfortunately, it's nobody's fault. There is no fault here. What happens is people get demoralized. It's like a military unit. It's like pick any unit that you work in. Schools right now, we have very low teacher morale. When morale gets law enforcement, low morale right now. So if you have low morale, what happens is people begin to fracture. They begin to think it's all on me. I'm gonna do it on my own. And we have to understand that to beat the Democrats at this game, because they are very unified. Credit to them. They are unified. Okay. They're unified around the wrong things. They've gone far left. They're all, extreme radicals, but I mean, not all, but there's an awful lot of their leadership in the chambers, both chambers, that are not in sync with everyday sensibilities of Mainers. But yet they are unified. Okay. And we
Yep.
need to understand that in order to win, we have to believe in ourselves. We have to believe in the vision of the future that we have, and we have to work harder than we have ever worked in all 16 counties to not only unify around someone in the primaries and hopefully out of the primaries, but to then pivot and say, this isn't just about winning a primary. This is about leading the state in the right direction. And the hard work will begin when we win the governorship in both chambers.
Yeah, and right now, what people need to do, again, I think we are on the right side, and I think people have been afraid to speak up because they're afraid of being canceled. They're afraid of all these things, but we are on the right side of history, especially with these trans issues, and even like with the mass people in the state of Maine, abortion all the way up until birth, the
Yeah.
taxation. Like when you look at all the major issues that people care about, they are on the wrong side, but they're doubling down. The Democrats are giving us an opportunity. We need to make sure that we take advantage of it. Mills is giving us a great opportunity. We need to take advantage of it. It's unfortunate because of who it's hurting. Like in the meantime, these girls are getting trophies taken away from them. They're having to be in unsafe spaces, but they're giving us an opportunity, and we need to make sure that we take advantage of it and work together. I think that's the biggest thing that I would say to anybody who's paying attention is we need to work together in order to be able to win. I feel like to some degree that the Republican Party can sometimes feel like the Council of Elrond in the Lord of the Rings, where people are arguing and yelling, "This is what we should do. This is what we should do," and then Elrond says, you come to answer the threat of Mordor. You will unite or you will fall. We have a great opportunity here. We can win, but we have to work together.
You,
That means the
I'll
grassroots,
give
the
you a,
party, the candidates,
yeah.
all that stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just give you a closeout thought. And
Yeah.
again, I spent 10 years as an intelligence officer in the Navy, and I learned far more than I contributed. And what did I learn? You have to approach anything that really matters in life Maybe it's making sure that a lifeboat gets ashore. Maybe it's an environment where there is some life and death outcome that is going to be. I consider this a life and death race in 2026 for the state of Maine. And so my point here is, it's really, we have to subsume who we are, and I'm ready to do that. I look at people like Bruce Poliquin, who has actually done that incredibly consistently over the course of his whole time. It is not about us individually. It's not about me. It's not about anybody. It is about the mission. If we can unify in order to win the mission, then we will, in fact, save this state. We will turn around the education system, the public safety side of this. We will get the budget back under control. We will reduce taxes. We will obviously do things that are moral compass, get us back on our moral compass. And we will empower the kids in this state, not just to do well in school and to come out of school with success, but to stay here in the state of Maine, to found companies, to work for companies, to feel good about this place that we all grew up in. And I say that because, Chuck, in the end, it is about the mission. It's never about the person. And Reagan would tell you that, and Patton would tell you that, and Bradley would tell you that, and Eisenhower would tell you that. And yeah, we need to tell ourselves that, and then we need to believe it. Because if we are all willing to be kind of subsidiary to the mission, we will win in 26, whoever the party is, and whoever the people who are the candidates are. But if we decide that it's all about us, well, we'll fail again.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. So get out there and get involved. If you haven't already got involved, people, get connected to your county committee, your city committee, and figure out what you can do to help. And also a reminder to everybody, if you're in the Bangor Brunswick Brewer, or Bangor Brewer, I should say, area, Old Town areas, there is a vote tomorrow where we can take a seat back in the Maine legislature, vote for Carolyn Fish, our candidate up there in the special election. And that is all for today. Thank you for coming on, Bobby. I really appreciate you taking the time and your perspective and sharing, your legal expertise with us, and your understanding of the breakdown between state and federal law, which is sometimes difficult to understand. And unfortunately, I think that to some degree that's going to remain muddy water, because it sometimes is determining, it's a case by case on when it's a state versus a federal. So, but I appreciate
never
clarifying that.
Never underestimate the power of people to muddy the water. So
that's right.
I'm with you.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you all.
All right, man.
We'll
Thank
see
you
you all back on Thursday. All right. Have a great